Attention all grill masters and backyard barbecue enthusiasts. Lynn's has everything you need to make your 4th of July cookout a success. From sizzling certified Angus beef steaks and mouth-watering burgers to fresh cut fruit and all the condiments you desire, we have you covered. Browse our weekly ad for celebratory savings like 39 cents per pound seedless watermelon through July 4th and shop online at lynsgrocery.com for extra convenience. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Everyday Fi, the show that explores the lives of everyday people in the financial independence community. I'm your host, Megan Combs, and today I'm chatting with Lan, a new-ish follower of Fi. In this episode, we dive into Lan's money story, including her journey from teaching to tech and her experience growing up poor. We also dive into the concepts of having immigrant parents and how hard it is to escape the cycle of poverty. And we talk about Lan's love of travel and learning other languages. Lan's story is one you don't want to miss, so tune in to hear more. Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today. So I am talking with Lan, and I'm super excited about this because she reached out to me about being on the podcast, one of my first form submissions on the website, which is very exciting. So just in case anybody's wondering, there is a way to submit your name to be on the show if you want to tell your Fi story, and I'll link it in the show notes. But yeah, Lan, thanks for being here. How are you doing today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me on the show. It's a great honor. I've been following you and listening to all your shows.
Oh, thank you. That's yay. I'm very excited that I'm reaching more people and more people are able to hear all these really incredible stories. And I'm excited to hear yours. So yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, family details, current job, career, or if you're already retired on the Fi path, like what's that like? Yeah, share whatever you want about yourself.
I'm 41 years old. I live with my partner, no kids. I have a lot of hobbies. I like to do arts and crafts, read, listen to podcasts, listen to audiobooks, watch movies, do workouts, and so on and so forth. A lot of my funds, I would say, go toward international travel. That's really important to me, to be able to be in a different country, in a different culture, listening to a different language, seeing how other people live and the possibilities for having a different way of life. In terms of career, similar to you, I have heard you say that you were previously in a less lucrative career. That was the case for me as well. And actually in my 20s, in addition to going to undergrad, I spent time doing a master's program and a PhD program. That meant that I actually had very few years of full-time employment and full-time salary. I was counting, and I think I only worked about 2.5 years full-time during my 20s. And of course, during my school years in higher education, I was working a bunch of part-time jobs and had side hustles. And it wasn't until my mid-30s that I switched into, like you, tech, specifically technical project management and technical product management. And that's when I started having a more substantial salary. And I bring this up because the earlier wave of Fi, as many of us already know, consisted of, I'll just say it, like cisgendered white men who were in tech and made a ton of money straight out of undergrad, so in their 20s, and they were able to retire in their 30s. That was not the case for me and a lot of people in the current wave. That's why we have podcasts like Catching Up to Fi. I would say I probably fit into that audience where I was a late starter, and it doesn't matter where you are. You start where you are, and it's not too late.
Yeah, I love that. And I love Catching Up to Fi. Bill and I have chatted previously, and I also feel like I'm a little late to the Fi movement too, because when you compare yourself to the folks who are like, oh, I started saving when I was 22 and retired when I was 30. I'm like, well, I'm 37 and only have $150,000 invested. So I don't feel quite at the same level. But yeah, I agree with you. It's more like we're on the normal path, I guess, but we want to be on the five, like the early five path. So yeah, I totally get that. And I have so many questions. So first, what kind of arts and crafts do you do? I love arts and crafts. Sitting there coloring with a group of friends is one of my favorite pastimes. So what kind of arts and crafts do you do?
That sounds actually really fun. The idea of sitting around and coloring with friends. I might borrow that idea from you. I actually do a lot of solo arts and crafts. My favorite thing to do is upcycling, where I take existing materials and make new things. I will take existing cards, magazines, paper, and so forth, and make new cards to give to people. Recently, or I would say lately, I've been doing this for a while actually. I will take existing clothes that others don't want, that others no longer want, or that I no longer want. Then I make new clothes out of it, or I will do something to retrofit it to make it different. That's my favorite activity, I would say, for now in the arts and crafts sector.
I love all of that. Yeah, so as you said, my previous career was in something less lucrative, i.e. art. And so I love art of any kind. And so that's why that was one of the important questions on my mind is what you do. And so that's kind of leads into my next question though. What was your previous field before tech?
I was in the field of education, and I was actually a teacher. And I eventually moved more into ed tech. And then from there, I did what I call tech. That means that I finally moved out of education. So I actually started as a teacher.
Yeah, that's amazing. What level of teacher, like what grades, were younger, middle school, high school, college? And then what prompted you to make the change?
I have taught all grades. I have worked with high school students. I've also worked with elementary and middle school students, also adults. So adults in terms of adult learning outside higher education institution, and then also undergrad students and grad students. And why I left, to be honest, it ties into my money story or my money background. At some point, I felt a little disappointed at myself in thinking about my salary, because in this capitalist society, that's how you're measured. Your success is measured in terms of how much money you make. And I think I was probably comparing myself to my peers and people in my age group and thinking I could be making more money. And looking at my past where I didn't have a lot of money growing up, I did feel like I was lacking financially. And so I started to look into a career that would pay more.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's unfortunate. The first thing, of course, that sprung to my mind was comparison is the thief of joy. But it makes me wonder, are you happier now in your tech career than you were in your education career, or do you kind of miss it?
That's a good question. And I will provide a little bit more context. I made a switch to tech, and that meant that I started working in the private sector and then corporate America. And corporate America is not who I am. It was really not a good fit for me. It took me over 3 years to realize that. And after that, I actually moved back to the education slash nonprofit world, but still doing tech. And that was a very good decision for me. I took a huge pay cut, at least 30%, I would say. It was a really hard decision to make, especially for someone like me who I grew up poor. And so money for me, and not just was a signifier of where I stood in society, but it was security for me because of my background. And so I had to make that really big decision of giving up climbing this corporate ladder or corporate career ladder and giving up this nice big income and my restricted stock units and so forth to do something that was a better fit for me and that would give me a better work-life balance. And I am so glad I made that decision. I was talking to a lot of people to get some advice and their input when I was in the process of making that decision. And someone said, "You're really good with money. You'll be fine. That pay cut won't even matter." And that person was 100% correct.
And those are the kind of friends we all need in our lives, the ones who compliment us, encourage us, support us. I love that you had friends that did that for you. So now I'm very curious about your background, and I'd love to hear more about your early money story. And one of the questions I like to ask is, what is one of your earliest money memories and how it kind of maybe started to shape your money philosophies as an adult?
I actually really like this question because it provides a lot of context on how someone views money and how they use or manage their money today. For me, like I mentioned, I grew up with very little. I actually, at some point, I think as an adult, looked up the guidelines of what it means for a household to be in poverty. And looking back, my household as a child when I was growing up fits that. And what that looked like was that I remember looking forward to going to school because I would have two reliable meals, breakfast and lunch. It also looked like for me washing my clothes by hand because I didn't have a washer and dryer and no one was going to take me to the laundromat. Also, I'll mention that my parents and actually my brothers were refugees who came to the US with very little, and they had very little when they started out their lives here, and that continued when I was born. And that meant that because I had the privilege of being born in the US, I grew up speaking English in native capacity. And what happens, it's pretty common if you read the literature on immigrants and refugees. The parents often rely on their children to be the translators because growing up here and being born here, I was able to know English and learn English and to the point where I knew it more than my parents. And so I had to do a lot of translations, including paying our bills, signing up for things like food stamps and so forth. So I was very involved from a very young age with how money basically runs the world.
Wow, that's an incredibly deep thing for a child to have to do right out of the gate. And I'm really sorry that your parents and your brother were refugees. Where were they refugees from?
My family came from Vietnam.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, that's an amazing story, though, that they were able to come here and kind of start this new life. And I think it's interesting that you use the word privileged that the fact that you were born here means that you were privileged, even though you grew up in a way that a lot of people would say is not privileged. The part where you said you got two reliable meals by going to school, that struck me. And having to wash your clothes by hand, that's like the definition of not privilege. So it's interesting that even just being born here could be seen that way. And I hope a lot of people who are listening take that away, because privilege doesn't mean not work hard, right? Privilege just means, where did you start in relation to somebody else? And how does that allow you to get further along? And I'm really glad that we're talking about this. And I actually want to kind of harken back to what you said earlier about this new wave of FI. I actually really love that concept because you're right. The first wave was bros who worked in the tech sector and basically made huge salaries and lived on milk crates and ramen noodles and were able to retire early. And well, that's not the vibe for all of us. But I think people like Brad and Jonathan and Paula Pant and Catching Up to Five and everybody are all making changes. They want to change that rhetoric. They're like, that's not who we are, and we want to be more inclusive, and we want to bring people into this movement who maybe look different and are different than that. And what I really hope is that is seen in the outside world, because I think a lot of the outside world who look in on FI still see that first wave. And I'm hoping that soon they'll start seeing this second wave and start seeing that, like, oh, the FI movement is different than it used to be. It's one of the reasons I'm doing this show. I want to give voice to people who are not white bros. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing your story. And so what I'd like to know is, how did you growing up this way and this heavy reliance on you by your parents shape your money philosophies as an adult? Have you noticed distinct parallels between those experiences and your experiences as an adult when it comes to money?
I would say that, yes, definitely. First, like many people I have heard when they're interviewed and they talk about their money story, I developed a scarcity mindset that I still have not been able to let go of. I listened to a couple interviews with Amy Binkley of Five Freedom Retreats, and I was really intrigued by her story about how in the beginning, when she was younger, she was pretty comfortable financially or economically with her family. And then there was a huge shift in her life with her family. And then she was less comfortable and she developed a scarcity mindset. And I liked how she said that. But at some point, that didn't serve her anymore, because in some ways, it is good to have a scarcity mindset, because that is how I ended up saving a ton. And I am allergic to debt. I don't have debt. That doesn't exist to me other than mortgage debt. And I'm very good with managing my funds, even when I didn't know about the details about saving for retirement. For example, I didn't have access to a retirement account from an employer for a long time. And even when I did, I literally did not know that you could contribute more than the match from your employer, that there's this limit set by the IRS. I didn't know that until way later. But I still saved my money, and that was because of my scarcity mindset. And then at some point, like Amy Minkley has also said, it becomes a barrier for you, because now maybe you're doing yourself harm because you don't need to think like that anymore. I still look at prices really carefully when I go grocery shopping. Do I need to do that? Absolutely not. Could I just go to the grocery store and buy whatever I want? Yes, rationally, I know that. But there's a part of me that hasn't accepted it yet. And so it's very obvious to me that my childhood has and is still informing my current life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for sharing that. I will say that scarcity mindset, like you said, is incredibly beneficial when you are in a survivor type of situation where you literally are needing to survive. And so a scarcity mindset protects you. But it's when we start to get to the point of thriving where we forget that we no longer need this scarcity mindset. And then it starts to limit the way that we're living. But it's incredibly hard to let go, because it provided that sense of protection for so long that it's not something that you can just buy more food at the grocery store. Like that idea of I can just do this. No, there's a lot of mental barriers in place for sure. And so it's one of those things where I think I've mentioned on the show before that I'm a huge fan of therapy. I've been in therapy for 7 years. freaking changed my life. And I feel like this is one of those things that really requires a third party, unbiased party that can help you strip down all of those layers between you and this mindset. I'm not telling you that you need to go to therapy. I'm just you as in the general you who's listening. If you are able to work through each of those layers that is holding you to that scarcity mindset, I almost see it as like strings holding you to it. And if you just systematically clip through each of those, then someday it will just let go. And then you can just live your life. It's almost like we in the 5 movement love the idea of freedom, and we see financial independence as a way to have that freedom. But a scarcity mindset, that's not freedom. That's not freedom at all, right? And people who have millions of dollars have scarcity mindsets, and yet they're not free to live the life they want because, as I quote many times on the show, Ramit Sethi has said, the way you feel about money is highly uncorrelated to the amount of money that you have. Anyway, so I'm right there with you. I see a scarcity mindset as beneficial at first, but then something that is really hard to let go, but is necessary to actually live that life of true financial freedom. Before we move on to your specific FI journey, is there anything else you wanted to talk about with your earlier money story and background? Anything that you remember about your parents saying about money? Did they teach you anything specific about money? Did they have any philosophies themselves that they passed on to you or anything like that?
First, I wanted to piggyback off of what you said about therapy. I'm glad you brought it up because I think it's important to normalize a conversation and treat it like it's a normal part of life. I've actually been in therapy for well over a decade. There's always something to work on. Everyone has something to improve upon. And just to get back to your question to further what I had said about my money story, I would say that I developed really a bit of a fear of not having a secure place to live because there would be situations where water would be cut off because we couldn't pay for the bill. And there would be situations where we would get the electric bill, for example, and people who don't manage their electric bills may not notice this, or people who pay their electric bill, on time, will not notice this, but your bills start to change color. If you have a paper bill, it becomes like red when it's time to warn you that the electricity will get cut off. And then once it gets cut off with in terms of electric and the water, it's very painful to get it back on because you have to pay the late fees, you have to pay the current balance, and then you have to pay some kind of initiation fee to turn it back on. And so that type of cycle, I would say, instilled a lot of fear in me to always have and make sure that I have enough funds and to make sure I have a secure place to live and to have a place where those types of bills would not come my way. And just to reiterate, those things have stayed with me for decades now and inform and shape who I am.
That sounds really terrifying. And I'm really sorry that you went through that. I was getting a little emotional as you talked about that because this simple thing of getting your electricity turned off and then having to pay all of this money to get it turned back on again when you couldn't afford the original bill. This audience is the epitome of the cycle of poverty. People think that people who are poor, just get better paying jobs. Just live below your means. It is so not that simple because it's like having hurdles placed exactly where you have to land to not trip over the next one to even be able to get anywhere. I think of like a car, right? A lot of places in the United States require a car to have a job because you have to drive there unless you live in a city where there's public transportation, but there's not that many cities and all those cities are very expensive. So how do you get a car? You either pay in cash, which people who are poor do not have the means to do that because they don't have a job and so they have to finance it. But because they are poor, their credit scores are usually a lot lower than normal. And so to finance a, say, $3,000 car, they have to take out a loan that's in the double digits for a $3,000 car. So this $3,000 car is almost double what it originally was because they have to take out the maximum amount of the loan terms with the maximum amount of interest because they just can't afford it, but they have to have the car to have a job. And so that's how you keep people in a cycle of poverty. And it's ridiculous. I applaud you for being able to work your way out of that. Let's switch to your FI journey and how you came to find the financial independence movement. I'd love to hear that story. I'd love to hear which FI person you first were introduced to, how you're introduced, and then also why you liked the financial independence movement specifically out of all the other types of personal finance that are out there.
I learned about FI formally when I was making my switch out of corporate America. Part of that decision was thinking about COVID 2020 and how that was a difficult year in terms of the world being turned upside down, feeling some isolation, reading in the news every day about people passing away due to COVID, hearing about friends of friends, family, and so forth who lost their lives due to COVID. I know it's been 4 years since that, and maybe a lot of us are living a post-COVID life, which I'm grateful for, but I haven't forgotten how that felt. And there were other situations where very close friends of mine who are basically like family to me were in serious medical conditions. All of this made me realize how short life is and how tomorrow is not guaranteed. When I was still working in my corporate job, then I started asking myself, if today were my last day, would I wanted to spend it this way? And my answer consistently was no. And that's how I started thinking about living a different life and switching to another job, like I mentioned earlier. And while I was thinking about this, I started looking up podcasts because I listen to a ton of podcasts. You can tell I'm a follower of you because I know that you do too. You have mentioned that you listen to podcasts like 5 hours a day while you're gardening and so forth. Similarly, I listen to podcasts while I'm doing chores, cooking, cleaning, laundry, and I started looking up podcasts and I found a lot of, I would say, smaller podcasts. I do like the bigger podcasts, like definitely shout out to Choosify, which I still listen to. But I really enjoy the smaller podcasts. There's one from Maggie Tucker and Michael Leary, Friends on Fire, and that has since transitioned to Maggie Tucker's Inside Out Money. I also listen, and at the time started listening to the Two Sides of FI. I have also really enjoyed Rich and Regular with Kirsten and Julian Saunders. Obviously, I started listening to your podcast when it came out. And then later, Mark's Money Mind, so many. And listening to those were really helpful because I really enjoy listening to other people's journeys and all the different questions that they have. And I found that I had similar questions. And it didn't actually matter too much whether someone grew up very financially comfortable or not. Somehow we land on the same questions. And I found that very interesting. So we could relate to each other that way. That's why when you go to live FI events, you immediately have conversations with people about their values. because we all share similar values. That's how I formally started with my FI journey, I would say. But I was on the FI journey by accident, and I'm one of those accidental FI people, I would say, because I was very good at saving.
Yeah, I've met several people as I do this podcast who are accidentally FI. And let me just say, I'm very jealous of you guys because I have to be very purposefully FI because I will spend my money. For anybody who listens to the Choose FI earlier episodes, I'm definitely more of a Jonathan than I am a Brad. I feel like Brad's the one who's very frugal, doesn't really spend a lot of money. I think he mentions like throw pillows. He's like, I don't need any throw pillows. Whereas Jonathan's like, I can't wait till I can buy the next car because it's so fancy and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that's me. I'm like, how long do I have to wait before I can buy this new thing? Or, oh, look at that new throw pillow. That's really cute at Target. Yeah. So I love that you say that you're accidentally FI, and I'm jealous of that. And I'm jealous of anybody who's like that. But I also know that there are more people out there like me. I just haven't met that many of them yet who have to be purposely FI. That's amazing that you do listen to a lot of podcasts. Like, I think you listen to more than me because I've got Ramit Sethi's, obviously, Choose FI, So Money, Her Money, Money with Katie, Afford Anything, Mark's Money Mind, and My FI Capsule. No, we're probably about the same. And I'm so behind. But yeah, so I'm with you. I love podcasts. What attracted you to podcasts in general as a form of education?
I'm generally a nerd, I would say. And I love learning. I'm a lifelong learner. I actually do read books still, physical books or books on Kindle. I like the idea of blogs, but because of work, I'm on the computer so much. So I don't necessarily want to read on the computer. And so that's why I read physical books or a Kindle or listen to books or listen to podcasts. I think I was one of the earlier listeners, things like NPR, when it eventually moves onto the internet. I listened to Science Friday, Planet Money, and now all of those are podcasts. And I'm pretty sure that's how I developed that habit, because I would listen to NPR while doing things that were a bit mindless, I would say, or that didn't require too much of my attention. And then once podcasts became more popular with things like Serial, that's how I started listening to podcasts.
Yeah, that's how I feel about it. I like the concept of podcasts are almost the closest you can get to educational osmosis, because you can do it in a way that's more passive than doing things like having to read. When you read, you can only read, unless I guess you could listen to books on tape. How old am I? Books on Spotify or Kindle or whatever. I don't know, whatever. Kids, did you know that there used to be tapes? Anyway, yes. Actually, I don't know. Side note, my parents, we would go on road trips in our big 1990 Oldsmobile Silhouette that had like bucket seats and a maroon interior. And my stepmom would read to us, like physically from the book. She would read to us as we were driving, because the tape player in the van was broken. So she would read to us. And it was actually really cool because she would do all the voices. It was really fun.
Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Now is the time to make a plan. Whether you plan to vote absentee by mail, in person at your county auditor's office before Election Day, or at your polling place on November 5th, it's important you take steps now to make your plan at voterready.iowa.gov. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Find more info at voterready.iowa.gov. This message is presented by the Iowa Secretary of State.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Milkey. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.
What is your ultimate why of FI? I mean, we've talked a lot about this, that like a big part of it for you is that you see that life is short. You kind of have this a little bit of scarcity mindset, so you want that level of protection. But is there more to it than that? When you think of the other side of financial independence and not having to work anymore, what does that look like to you? What does your everyday look like to you?
Optionality is really important to me. That's a big why of FI. People call it FU money or the host of how to money. They say it in a very nice way. Peace out money. That's important for me to have because I don't assume that I will always have my job. Things change, even if it's not due to you. You can't control everything, but you can control your finances. I like to control what I can. And getting back to that word control, it's important to me to be able to have the control. If I don't have a job, that's fine. I still have control of my life. I can still continue living the way I live, and I'm not going to be interrupted at all. If I were not working at all, I would do more of what I already do. And just going back to the current wave of FI, let's call it that, a lot of it is about lifestyle design. The pioneers call it slow FI, for example. It's about living purposefully and not waiting for that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's enjoying the journey. And that means doing some of what you see yourself doing in the future. Let's do that now. So I try to do a lot of that. And that's why I actually have a lot of hobbies. Like I talked about arts and crafts, reading. I travel a ton, both domestically and internationally. I exercise at home. I go cycling. I go on walks. I actually very fond of foreign language learning. So going back to podcasts, I listen to podcasts in other languages, and I study foreign languages at home for fun. I review my old notes, my old textbooks. I started taking private Spanish lessons. I've never learned Spanish before, ever formally, but I started taking that language for the first time with a private tutor. So that's what FI would look like for me, but more of it, and also more control of my time, because I wouldn't have to log on to the computer for work or going to the office for work. I would have more geographic freedom. I would probably travel a lot more than I already do. I would do formal language classes rather than only tutoring or reviewing textbooks and such. I would love to be in the country where the language is spoken and go to class 4 hours a day. Like I said, I'm a nerd who wants to go back to school for 4 hours a day. I do.
Yeah, no, I'm so there with you. I sometimes miss school. And of course, 19-year-old me would be like, shut up. No, you don't. Remember all those papers you had to write? But really, school was so much fun. My favorite kinds of classes were the ones that were 3 hours long. There was maybe 10 people or less in the class. And you did some sort of reading beforehand. And then during the class, you discussed what you read for 2 hours. It was freaking awesome. I loved it. I was like, how can I get a job doing this? Yeah, there aren't any jobs like that. Not really. All jobs have some painstaking admin crap that you have to do. Podcasting is the closest, I would say. But there is still some painstaking admin crap that I have to do for this show, which is fine. But yeah, no, but I'm so there with you. I'm also a dork who loves learning. I tried taking French lessons, but it was only once a week. And she was like, if you really want to learn the language, you've got to dedicate more than just once a week in this class. And there was no way, not with my job. My job at the time was having me work till 9 at night a lot. And I was like, I can't do this. And what I would love to do is teaching English as a second language in another country. Because I've heard that's some of the easiest ways to learn another language is go and move to those remote areas where a lot of people don't know English and teach English. And then you are forced to speak the language because nobody knows English. So you have to learn their language. And I know a guy who did that in Spain, and he learned Spanish in a year. And he was fluent in Spanish in a year because he was in a small town outside of Madrid, I think, or Barcelona. And I just think that would be so much fun. So speaking of travel, where is your next trip that you're going to take? And where was your last trip that you took?
I travel a lot. So I had to think about what my next trip was. And I was thinking, is it next year? But actually, it's coming up. I'm going to Mexico to see a friend's cousin. So I'm going with that friend. And it will be fun because it will be the first time going to a Spanish-speaking country after having taken Spanish lessons. So I'm determined to speak Spanish when I'm there. My last trip was in April and May. We're recording in early August for reference. I went to Germany and Italy. I saw 2 friends in Italy. I know people who have actually moved abroad and have lived abroad for a long time and have established their lives there. In Italy, it was time for me to stuff my face with pasta and a lot of other delicious food. I have so many places that I want to go, and I'm not going to name them all, but definitely want to hit more Spanish countries so that I can practice Spanish and learn more about the different cultures of the various countries, mostly, hopefully in South America and Central America. And actually wanted to circle back about the point about going to another country to teach English. I actually did that straight out of undergrad for about 6 months in Japan. I was in a sizable city, I would say. I was trying to remember because I've been to Japan probably 9 times or so. And when I was teaching, it was fun because there was a lot of free time to meet friends who are Japanese outside of teaching. And that meant that I got to practice Japanese. And then I also had a Japanese tutor. And I also found that I could take Japanese classes at a community center. And prior to that, I had taken Japanese as an undergrad, and I went to study abroad twice or so as an undergrad to study Japanese. And then I also took a leave of absence to intern in Japan and use more Japanese, but mostly English, I would say, because it was an international business kind of program. All this to say, there's so much of the world to see and so many languages to learn so that we can communicate with others.
Yeah, there really are. So how many languages would you say you know? And by know, I mean could passably hold a conversation in?
I'm going to conservatively say 2. I'm probably more comfortable with listening or hearing Japanese in context and speaking, so I'm not counting that. And my Spanish skills are abysmal at this point, but I am optimistic I will get better because I had only started and I know what it's like to start from the very beginning because of the other languages I've learned. My family spoke Cantonese and Vietnamese, and so I learned some Cantonese. So when I was in Hong Kong, I could kind of talk like I'm an elementary school student, I would say, in Cantonese. But I learned Mandarin later in life and took Mandarin classes with the undergrads while I was doing my PhD by choice because I wanted to learn some form of Chinese. And I actually spent 8 weeks in Beijing studying Chinese and going to classes and living with the host family. And I became pretty conversant then, but that was over a decade ago. And so I have tried to keep that language up. So I still practice it a little bit by talking to a friend who lives in China now. We'll meet online every few weeks to catch up in Chinese. And I try to listen to Chinese podcasts and read my textbooks and my own notes. So I can probably have a conversation, not probably, I can have a conversation in Mandarin Chinese, but definitely not fluent. But that's another opportunity for me to spend time in a country that speaks that language and study that language.
Yeah, that's incredible. I love that your reason for travel is to learn other languages. I think that's so cool. And I think that's a great reason to travel and is going to be on my list for traveling. I try really hard to at least learn some basic phrases in the countries I'm visiting, so I'm not like the ugly American as much as possible. But, I always freeze up. It feels like I can do it at home. And like you said, I have an ear for listening. I can usually understand what they're saying as long as I lean in and really concentrate. But then to respond back, I'm like, okay, what is it in English? Okay, now translate it into that language. And like 5 minutes have gone by and the person's like, hello. So I tried to speak French when we were in Paris and I was okay. I got a lot better towards the end of our trip, but then we left and now I'm back to being not great. Yeah, I think you alluded to this, that language is very much like learning math. If you don't consistently do it, you will just forget it. I don't know anybody who remembers algebra anymore unless they use it in their daily lives. It's very similar. So I hope you find some Mandarin folks that you can practice with. I'm going to switch topics really quick and talk about your strategy for reaching financial independence.
I'm boring. I'm typical simple path to wealth, to reference Gail Collins. First, I started by saving because I didn't know where else to put my money, but I didn't want to spend my money. I actually don't recall how I knew about low cost index funds, but in 2010, I finally moved a substantial chunk of my money from my savings account to a low cost index fund in Vanguard. And from there, I kept contributing or adding to my brokerage fund until I had a retirement account from my employer. Then I started contributing to that, and that's pre-tax or deferred tax. And at first I was just doing the minimum to match the employer contribution, like I had said earlier, because I simply didn't know about maxing out on my employer retirement account. And once I learned about being able to max that out, then I did. So that means I only started doing that over the past 4 years or so. That means that my funds are very lopsided. So a lot of it lives in my brokerage accounts. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because I still have a good chunk of funds because I didn't spend my money, or I didn't spend a lot of it. Another podcast I actually listened to is Mile Hi-Fi. That's one of the earlier ones I started listening to. One of the hosts is Doug Cunnington, and he has said that he and his wife on purpose made the choice to put more of their funds into a taxable brokerage account instead of their 401k. And it was because you decide what you want to optimize for. That strategy allows them to optimize for flexibility. Whereas if you put it into your retirement accounts, there are ways to have early withdrawal strategies and so forth, but you have to plan well in advance to do that conversion ladder or the T70 and all that. So I was very glad to hear someone say that, because saying this out loud sounds a little silly, right? That I was feeling a little bad that I didn't have more in my retirement account, but wait a minute, I'm doing more than okay, and I'm perfectly fine. So thank you, Doug Huntington, for that. Other than that, there isn't much to it, honestly, other than not spending and not accumulating debt. I just never had debt for that long of a time because of how I grew up. I think some people who grow up with very little go to the other side of the spectrum or other end of the spectrum, where then they spend a lot because they never had the opportunity to spend. And when you're an adult, you have the access to credit cards. But I was actually in the other extreme. I have credit cards, but again, being accidental FI, I spend and then pay it off immediately. So it's like I'm basically spending cash, but getting the points for using a credit card and getting the protections that come with using a credit card. I also don't rely on debt. Even when I was going to undergrad, for example, I don't know how exactly I figured it out, but obviously it's because I was good with money from a young age. I knew that it wouldn't make sense to take on a ton of debt to go to undergrad. So I went to a public university to start. And after that, I actually transferred to a private institution that is very wealthy, meaning that it has a very high endowment. So if you're fortunate enough to go to a school that has a high endowment and you're also low income, then there's a lot of need-based financial aid. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I remember that my 3 years at that private institution that had lots of money, it was cheaper for me to go there for 3 years than to go to 1 year of my public in-state university. So it was a bit of not like I was exactly planning to go to a wealthy school in the end, because I probably would have been fine if I had stayed at that public institution, given that it was in-state. But it gave me a leg up because I didn't have to think about debt so much, and I paid off my student loans, the small amount that I had, or a relatively small amount that I had, probably within a year. And again, I just did not make that much money, right? Because I never really worked full time for that long until sometime in my 30s, but it wasn't that much to begin with. And I just didn't spend a lot of money. That's just kind of like the story of my like financial strategy, I would say. And in terms of budgeting, I'm really not a budgeting type of person in the traditional sense. I don't need to, because you know that you're doing okay if you have a lot more funds in your accounts than when you started at the beginning of the month. That means that your spending is definitely lower than your income. And I hear over and over that people exaggerate or underestimate how much they spend. That's not the case for me, because it's very clear when I look at my statements. Yeah, I have a huge surplus. So that means that I don't spend a lot. But I only recently started actually tracking my spending. And that was when I was in that phase of going like formally FI, I would say, because I was curious. And also I realized that when I had switched to my corporate job and was making my nice corporate America money, that I was coming up with excuses to spend my money. Not to say that I regret that or that I did not deserve it, I guess, when I said I did, but I didn't like why I was doing it. I was doing it because I would tell myself I work so hard in this high pressure job because I want to make this money and now I get to spend it. Or I get to go out to eat now because I work so hard. And that was what I was telling myself. And I would end up spending money on things that I didn't care about or meals that I was disappointed at. And I really just didn't like that feeling. And that feeling of retail therapy is just not for me. So I wanted to rethink how I was spending my money. And I think Brad Barrett, Maggie Tucker, all these people I listen to talk about value as spending or spending on things that you value. And that's what I was trying to head toward. And also Maggie Tucker is a big proponent of this, and others on minimalism. I have a lot of stuff. I don't regret it, but I don't want more stuff and I want to get rid of my stuff too. So that's why I was tracking my spending or started tracking my spending, and I still do. So only recently started doing that. And I realized I was spending money on meals that, again, I just didn't care about. I was buying stuff that I kind of cared about, but not really. And at some point, I don't need more clothes or handbags or shoes. I'm done with that, I would say. And I kind of buy almost nothing now ever since I started tracking my spending. I also don't go out to eat for the sake of it because I think about why I was doing that. And a lot of times it was because I just want to hang out with friends. So now I just hang out with friends and do things that may or may not include going out to eat, depending on the situation. So I think that perspective of tracking my spending, not really just for the funding purpose of it or the financial aspect of it, but to think about what I value in life has been really important for me. So just to summarize, it's a combination of being me, meaning not spending a lot because I save a lot, and then tracking my spending to make sure that I'm spending on what I care about.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great strategy. And I laughed when you said you were boring, but the boring investments are the best investments because you don't have to think about them. They will grow really well. And actually, if they're boring, you're much less likely to mess around with them. So you're probably going to make more money overall. We know that if you mess with your investments more than you should, then you probably won't make as much as if you just left them alone. So I like the boring strategy. I am also just totally in total stock market index funds and everything. I don't do what is it that Joe Saul-Sehy talks about, the something frontier. I forget. It's like the best portfolio that you could possibly have. And you have to have a certain percentage in 8 or 12 different kinds of funds. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. It's funny how the value of spending is so important. But you really have to get honest with yourself because you can tell yourself you value anything, right? Your brain is very good at talking yourself into buying stuff because your brain has a tendency to go to its lizard brain side. For instance, I'm the spender, like I'm the opposite of you. And so when I think of eating out, it's not just to spend time with friends. It's because I literally love the idea of somebody making food and bringing it to me. Like I'm some sort of frog who's sitting there waiting for a fly to come by. I don't have to do any work. And so I have to be careful with that because I'm like, is that really what I value? And if that's true, then okay, then you can have that a couple times a month, but maybe not all the time. Today, for example, I spent on bird feeders and bird baths because I want birds in my yard because there's some bugs eating the plants and I don't want to buy pesticides. So I bought $75 worth of crap to have birds come to my yard. But was that a waste of money? Was it a value spend? I absolutely adore my garden. I love birds and I want to protect the bees. So it's hard I can always talk myself into spending. I'm very curious, what is your mindset when you kind of stop yourself from spending, I guess? I'm trying to, I can talk myself into spending anything. How do you kind of talk yourself out of spending? You know what I mean? What is literally going through your mind as you're either shopping or deciding not to shop?
That's a good question and requires really digging deep into my mind. First of all, a lot of times these days, I don't want anything because I already bought so many things. And when I look around my house, I wish I could get rid of some of the things I already have, but I'm human too, and I do want things as well. When that happens, these days, I tell myself, someone else already has this, so go to a Buy Nothing group on Facebook and ask, or get it used. Because part of the reason for decreasing consumerism for me is environmental. And to be a little honestly anti-consumerist because I don't want to buy things for the sake of it or to create demand. And then a company goes and produces more of a widget because they need to supply that demand. But I kind of zoom out and think about all those factors over. I have found that people have a lot of stuff that they no longer want, and they're happy to give it to you for free or at a low price. And sometimes you just have to wait for it. When I think about, do I need it now? The answer is 99% of the time, no. For example, I was listening to How to Money. I love that show. I love the two hosts. They're two best friends, so it's very adorable how they talk to each other. I like their banter. And one of them mentioned that as a hobby, they started roasting green coffee beans. I love coffee. And one way to do that is to use a popcorn popper. I think they use an air popper. And so I thought, oh, I want to try that. But I told myself, I'm not going to go and buy a popcorn popper because I know someone else already has that. And I was right. It took months, actually, but one of my coworkers said, oh, I have a popcorn popper. It's not the air popper, but it's a stovetop one. And they said, I don't need it anymore. Does anyone want it? Because it doesn't work with their stove anymore. And I said, I want it. And so that's what we use now to do our coffee roasting by hand for fun. And this has happened more than once already. And a really good example of this is with going back to books and audiobooks. I actually learned about the Libby app for public libraries from listening to Friends on Fire with Maggie Tucker and Michael Larry. And my strategy, again, is I don't need that book right away. I will just add it and put it as a hold because it could take weeks to come. But in the meantime, I'll read another book. So I'll have like a queue of multiple books going at one time. And I will just read or listen to the book as they become available. And when that time is up, because you only get 14 days, I just let it go and I put it on hold again, but I have another book to read. So I actually always have like 7 or 8 books, like audiobooks or actual like Kindle or hardcover books going at one time because of this cycle or rotation. And it doesn't bother me. If you're patient, you will get the thing you want for free or at low cost, and you will not have to add to consumerism.
I love all of that. And I feel like you are targeting me specifically because I literally went on the Libby app. I love the Libby app, by the way. It's awesome. And I had just finished, I like to read fantasy series. So big, long, like 5 book series or whatever. And I was just wrapping up one. And I knew the next one that I wanted to read, it was actually going to be a reread, but I didn't have the books. And I went on the Libby app and the first one was like a 6-week wait. And I was like, I don't want 6 weeks. So I bought all the books, hardback, first editions. Now, granted, this is an author I absolutely love. I love so much that I have a tattoo from one of her books. Actually, I have 2 tattoos from her books on my body. So to me, that was actually worth it. Like I said, I could talk myself into buying anything. But it's funny that you said that because I was like, oh my God, I wish Lan was in my life when that decision was there because I could have waited. And I could have read them on Libby and it would have been fine. And now you're making me want to go and cancel that like bird feeder and bird bath order so that I can just go and see like on Facebook if there's something for free or cheaper. So you're an inspiration to me, and I might just get your number and text you and be like, hey, I'm about to buy this. Talk me out of it. Actually, one thing that the Mint app had, the budgeting app that is now gone, and I'm very sad that they introduced, and I wish they would, like somebody would introduce this in a budgeting app. I'm using Credit Karma's now because that's where Mint moved to. But they had this thing where you could rate how you felt about certain transactions. And then it would I think it was like every week you could do that. And so you could cumulatively see over a week, like how you were trending in your spending. So did what you spent make you happy? Was it neutral, like a bill or something? Or did it make you sad? Do you regret spending it? And I like that they did it over a week because it let you have a little bit of distance between the transaction. And so if I noticed that I was having a lot more sad faces than I was happy faces or neutral faces or whatever, they're like bills you have to pay, I was like, okay, I need to maybe take a break for a week on spending things that I don't need. And that would usually help. But now that's gone and I don't have that. And I wish they would bring that back because I thought that was a really cool feature that taps into that little lizard brain inside us and actually makes you confront it and puts a mirror up to it in a very simple way, basically. So anyway, this is great. Yeah, I'm getting your number and I'm going to use you to talk me out of things. Okay, so let's switch to talking about your current struggles and wins. And I like to do struggles first because then we end on wins and wins are happy. So what are you currently struggling with right now? And it doesn't have to be FI related. It can be anything that you want to share with us that maybe we can learn from you.
I will share something that's FI related. I could probably not work right now and be okay, but I do think about something you have mentioned before, which is I may end up spending more in retirement with my newfound time. So I want to have a buffer for that. But also I need to work on getting over the fact that if I stop working, then money is going out and money is not coming in. And I've heard repeatedly on various podcasts from people who have retired early that it's a difficult feeling to have. So that's something that I want to work on. In terms of wins, a big win is something I already alluded to, which is I'm reducing my consumption of stuff, but also things like what's called pantry challenge, where you go through all the food you already have that's in your pantry, or in my case, I end up freezing a good amount of food. So I went through the freezer and try to eat as much of that stuff as possible so that it frees up space for new food items. Same thing with the pantry. That has freed up a lot of space as well. And mentally, it just feels better. I think people like Maria Kondo and all those other people in the Swedish art of death cleaning space and so forth talk about how mentally not having clutter or things around, I mean, physically not having those things also mentally helps to clear yourself as well. And I think that's true. So that's a huge win for me.
Yeah, I love that. It's something that I think a lot of us could go through some of the stuff that we've accumulated over the years, especially people who haven't done a move. I feel like moves are really great for purging things because you're like, I don't want to pack this. I'm going to do a garage sale or whatever, get rid of it. But when you haven't done a move in a while, like my mom just retired and she's lived in her house for, I think, 21 years now. And she's like, I cannot wait to go through all my drawers and get rid of everything. And yeah, so I think it's really beneficial. It does clear up that mind space. It's funny because I am definitely not a minimalist, but I'm not a maximalist or a hoarder either. Everything I own has some sort of sentimental value, which I think I mentioned this on the show before. The episode might not have published yet, but where I said that the hard thing is that everything I own has sentimental value. So therefore it's hard to get rid of. And if something breaks, it's more tragic because it's like, oh, that was my grandmother's or something. But the way that I kind of cut back on it is by buying a smaller house than I needed. And therefore you can't buy more crap because where are you going to put it? Where are you going to put it? So yeah, my 1,000 square foot house does not fit a lot of stuff. So I love that. Yeah, I'm right there with you. And I love Marie Kondo. One of my episodes came out with Sean and Katie. You haven't heard it yet because it's posting on August 12th, but people who are listening to this episode will have heard it. And they talk about minimalism a little bit. And Katie said something very profound where she said, everything that you buy is a piece of the earth, and it not only should spark joy, but it should sustain joy. And we were having this conversation of anything in the moment that you buy or have can spark joy. It's that your brain go into the lizard side of itself, where it's like it can talk itself into owning or buying anything. But can that object sustain its level of joy, or is it going to taper off? Like, that's what you have to really think of, right? And that's harder. That's a harder mental exercise to do, I think, when you're really thinking about it. But anyway, I thought that was really wise that she said that. I think it was her. It might have been her and Sean together saying that. But anyway, it's a great episode. Can't wait for it to come out. Yeah. So we're coming to the end of our time now, which is crazy. I feel like we just started. This conversation has been incredible. And so I'd love you to leave the community with a life hack, recommendation, or learning, or all three, that we can learn from and take away from.
I can mention 2 items. One is about kind of passively learning, like what you said. Like I mentioned, I'm really into books, and I started listening to a ton of audiobooks. So I keep hearing people say, I wish I read more, or I want to read more. For people who are thinking that way, I suggest trying audiobooks. And you can do or listen to audiobooks while you're doing your chores. And I have also heard people say that it's hard for them to multitask, like they really have to listen. I think that's also the case for me in some situations. And so I found that what I end up doing is I'm doing things a lot slower. If I'm folding laundry, I'm probably doing it slower than if I weren't listening to an audiobook carefully or a podcast and so forth. And that leads to my second point, which is about slowing down and being okay with not doing anything or doing things slowly. I have been more and more okay with doing things slowly or not doing anything at all. It has been a very hard journey for me to get to that point, but I'm trying to embrace just the idea of you can be and still be valuable, just like our beloved pets. They don't have jobs and we love them. And I like to think about the Mile High 5 podcast with Doug Cunnington and Carl Jensen, because they have this running joke about writing a book about how to be lazy. And then they'll say, well, we're too lazy to write it. And they do talk about embracing the idea of laziness. If they're listening, I have some thoughts about that. Maybe reframe it as idleness, because lazy has a negative connotation, whereas idleness is perhaps a little bit more neutral. Maybe we can make it more positive, but there is something to letting yourself be and rest and not do anything quote unquote productive. And I think I'm saying this more to myself than others.
No, yeah, it's like the art of stillness. I like the word stillness. And it doesn't need to be literal, right? You don't literally need to be still, but it's more like stilling your mind and your emotions and sometimes your body. Sure, we like to move a lot. At least some people do, not me. I love sitting on the couch. I could sit on the couch for 4 hours, but I really liked what you just said, that you can just be and be valuable. That was beautiful. I'm torn between using that as the show title and the second wave of 5, because those are both really good. You should trademark that. Well, this was really fun, Lan. Thank you so much. And thank you for getting vulnerable and really sharing deeply. That's where the true connection comes in this community, is sharing at the level that you did. So I really appreciate that. And I'm sure our audience does too. And I really loved meeting you and talking with you. And yeah, if people want to reach out to you to learn more or just chat, or maybe they want to use you to get them to stop spending money, how can they reach you?
People can find me on Facebook, especially if they're a part of the Camp Fi alumni.
Yeah, I'm in that group too. And I don't know if you saw the other day, did you see the Camp Fi Spain?
I did see that, and I put it on my calendar to get a ticket, and alas, it was sold out, but I added myself to the wait list.
Okay, so here's hoping that both of us get tickets, and then the first time we meet in person is going to be in Spain. Thank you so much for being here, Lan. Like I said, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I can't wait to do this again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Everyday 5 podcast. If you're loving the show, here are some things you can do. Number 1, subscribe in your favorite podcast player and share the show with your friends and family. Number 2, please leave a review. I'm always looking for ways to improve the show. Number 3, check out my website, everyday-fi.com, where you can listen to all the episodes and leave comments for myself and the guest. Number 4, if you're interested in sharing your own financial independence story, you can find a submission form at everyday-fi.com/podcast. And finally, number 5, join my Patreon membership for only $5 a month at patreon.com/everyday5podcast. This is a one-woman show, so every little bit counts. See you next time as we continue to go down the path to financial freedom.
Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Now is the time to make a plan. Whether you plan to vote absentee by mail, in person at your county auditor's office before Election Day, or at your polling place on November 5th, it's important you take steps now to make your plan at voterready.iowa.gov. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Find more info at voterready.iowa.gov. This message is presented by the Iowa Secretary of State.